But hi, everybody. I'm Tim Wallace. I'm the CEO of Turk.io. That's TURQ.io. We're a platform that enables everyday people to collaborate on writing legislation that we then pipeline into state and local legislatures. So I'm going to moderate our panel today for maintaining conversations between product and engineering. We've got an intro for everybody. We're going to go through some moderator questions. And then as Andy said, we're going to go through some audience Q&A. So for our panelist introductions, we're going to start with Elle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elle Nurmi. I work for a company called BookBuzz that does online ebook marketing, connecting readers with their next great read and authors with an audience. And I specifically manage engineering for our audiobooks product, Chirpbooks.
Thank you so much, Elle. All right, our next panelist is Cynthia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Andre. I'm a product manager over 6 years of experience, most recently in sales enablement. And I am excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Our next panelist is Maribel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maribel Gomez Mendoza. I am founder of Kidstarters, where we teach kids about entrepreneurship. So this is right up our alley. And I worked in product management for over a decade as a product manager, leading product manager. So it's one of my favorite things I've ever done. And I'm also a former engineer. Excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Maribel. And then our final panelist is Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. Excited everybody to actually be here on this panel with you. My name is Andrew Lau. I'm a co-founder and CEO of a company called Jellyfish. We're a startup based here in Boston. We're hiring. Apropos for today, really, we built Jellyfish for this team here, right? We actually are an engineering management platform that enables technology and product leaders to get visibility into large software engineering teams by combining data from engineering, business, and the sales world together to give you a 360 picture of your team.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start off with some of our questions. So our first question is, what tools do you use to manage the conversation and timeline between product and engineering? So I'm actually going to ask Andrew to kick us off with his thoughts on this question.
Thanks, Tim. Well, the easiest answer is you should use Jellyfish, right? Let's pause that for a second. We actually have a unique perspective because we have the benefit of actually working with dozens of customers and scaled software companies and can see across the variety of different practices at different scale, size, and industry. I think, what you're not going to find is actually, it's not that surprising. It's tools that you would think of, like Jira, for example, and the like there, but also road mapping systems, whether they be something like AHA or Product Board or Product Plan. But the surprising part of it actually is that the number of companies that actually are using things like Google Sheets for road mapping, and without actually a lot of coordination, how common a lot of folks are actually road mapping in a similar format across these different companies. So unique insights from our perspective there.
You mentioned a few different tools. You also mentioned different sized organizations that have to leverage these tools. Cynthia, I know one that Andrew mentioned is AHA, which is something that you've had experience with. Can you talk a little bit more about that tool and some other tools that you've used?
AHA is a road mapping software that allows for roadmaps, and not only roadmaps, but also cross collaboration with different users in the company. Some of the feature sets include notebooks that can contain different documentation around the initiatives that a company might be running. In addition, some of the more strategic features would include things such as creating a vision and the mission for your stories that you're working with. It's a great tool because oftentimes with these implementation tools, we're so occupied with execution that we don't get to step back and see why we're doing what we're doing. And AHA tries to, as long as the team is equipped and ready to put in the work, it really tries to organize that ideation.
So Maribel, I know that you've got experience across different size organizations. So when it comes to tools for maintaining good conversation, what do you specifically look for in tools, and how does that change depending on the size of the organization?
Yeah, so I think the tools that you mentioned are great, and sometimes having a very specific tool like AHA or Jira, or there's Trello, Asana, Notion. There's all the Atlassian suite.
There are a lot, yeah.
There's a plethora of tools out there, but for me, I've worked in like my own startup where we're tiny, and then in some mid-sized startups to huge corporations, and so I think looking at what does my team actually need now is really important, because sometimes we get this shiny new tool and it promises the world, which it might be perfect for a lot of teams, but it might not be perfect for where my team is now. And so sometimes I've been in the position where everybody got very excited for a new tool, and it felt like a very big hurdle to get everybody to use the tool, because it really wasn't what we needed at that time. If we could be fine with a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet or a Google table or whatever it might be, and that's enough, and it's working because the team is small enough, because the product number is small enough. If you're small and you can do with simple, I would advise to do simple before you get too complex. And then when you're ready for the complex, then you've kind of learned what are the elements that your team really needs. And I think from a focus on startups, I would definitely caution on, are we ready for this tool? And the other piece, the other side of this would be, with some of the things like AHA and some of the other product management tools specifically, are we able to be actionable with what we get from this tool? So we've put together this roadmap, but is it just a pretty piece of paper that we're going to put on the wall, or is it going to be something that we can be actionable with? Yeah. And so those are my kind of, I would say, advice when picking the tool.
I imagine Elle has something to say about actionable, as she's got more of the engineering perspective on this panel. Elle, what are your thoughts on the actionable nature of tools?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything you said, Maribel. I found the same to be true. Ultimately, the best tool is the tool that you actually use and the tool that actually works for you. And so I've definitely worked with teams where someone will get excited and we'll try something out, and then it turns out that we just can't get people to actually look at it because everybody is still just looking at the same spreadsheet they've been using forever. Sometimes that's frustrating, and sometimes it's just a sign that the spreadsheet's working really well for you and you don't need anything more complicated. And so finding the right way to finding the simplest possible solution is sometimes your best path forward. But I would say also the biggest piece here, you mentioned in the question, is communication. And so finding a format that actually helps everybody get the key pieces of information that they need, whatever those look like. There are tons of ways to set up each of these tools too. So we use Trello for managing day-to-day work, and then we use a whole lot of Google Docs and spreadsheets for managing a bunch of the longer-term strategic work. And the thing that I have found most key is figuring out, how do my stakeholders like to absorb information, and how can I put the right information in the right places where they'll actually see it? And that's ultimately more important than the tool that you're using.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Elle, talking about the communication back from engineering towards the business or customers or management, whoever it might be. I think most of us have experienced a time where product would want to have something delivered to a customer yesterday, and engineering has to be able to communicate, where are we at right now, what do we have in front of us, all that kind of stuff. So I think those were great points, and that actually leads me into my next question. Given that scenario of product wanting things delivered yesterday or right now, keeping burnout in perspective, we all know that burnout can be real for our engineers. So what is something that product can do to be disciplined about protecting engineering from burnout? Anybody want to jump in?
I'll start. So I think, at the end of the day, engineering and product management, you have different things that are important to each team. But at the end of the day, you're on the same team, you're in the same company, you have the same end goal. So I think it should be a mutual advocating for each other. And so, product management really communicating well with the engineering teams so that you have a true understanding of, is there burnout, or is it, you might think, is it just complaining, or is it actual burnout? And so having enough communication that you really truly understand it. And then at the same time, from the engineering side, saying, okay, let me truly understand what product management team is asking for, so that, we can try to balance it. And so I think it's getting to that, okay, we all have a really good understanding of what our customer end goals are. And so we're all working toward that same goal. And then we can be advocates for each other as we prioritize things.
Andrew, what are your thoughts? Oh, Elle wanted to
I was nodding because I was just agreeing with what
Elle came off mute, so I actually want to pitch it over to Elle.
Oh yeah. Real quick though, I think the two themes that I heard very strongly are really around partnership and empathy, right? I think Maribel, you let it's product and engineering are one together. They can't operate without each other, right? And that's the partnership part of it. And I think like in all relationships, empathy is really important. And like if you push it to the extremes, let's imagine the engineering team is burnt out. Well, product definitely isn't going to get what they actually want because no one's there to deliver it, right? So not that we ever want to push it to the limit conditions, but it helps you understand the boundary conditions of here. So, you really have to come back to working together across the two teams and making sure you're aligned in where people are going and what are the most important things to work on.
Elle, you want to go ahead and jump in now?
Yeah, I think Maribel got a lot of nods, because I think that all of that rings true to me as well, especially around making sure that the team is all pulling in the same direction. So product and engineering might be different disciplines, but you're usually all on the same team and usually pushing towards the same goals. And the more that you can emphasize that ultimately you're just trying to do the same thing, you're trying to get the best possible impact for your customer, is really important, and is part of cultivating, I think, a strong relationship. And then the other two things that I would say are, one, kind of to your point, Andrew, that it's important, especially working with more junior product managers who might not have had as much experience working with engineering teams, that one of the trade-offs that you're always weighing is, if you try to diversify the streams of work that you're working on and you want 7 different things done at the same time, you might actually get everything done more slowly than if you gave the engineering team 1 or 2 things to focus on. And so there's always kind of a balance there. And I see one of my jobs, definitely as someone who leads engineering teams, is this kind of always having the response of yes, if. So my job is not to say no to product. My job is never to say we can't do that. It's always to say yes, if this is true, right? If you can give me infinite resources, if you can give me 7 weeks, or if you are okay with this trade-off being made, or even saying, how urgent is this? Does this have to go out tomorrow? Because I can pull one of my hey team, we got to rally and do it. We got to get together and get this thing out. But you only get so many of those cards every year. So you have to be sure that this is the one that you really want to pull it on. And then you have to really rally around it and convince people why it's important to do this thing yesterday, right? And that's okay. And in startups, I think that does happen sometimes, but it's important to just be really conscious of the fact that you're asking that of people. And it's important to really have a clear sense of how this ties back to the ultimate goal that you have, right? Because if it's something that is clearly going to drive the goal that your team has, then it's a little bit easier, right, to make some of those trade-offs. But I think it all kind of comes down to that relationship and trust and understanding what the team is going through.
Yeah, I think that point of yes, if is a great one, Elle. We've heard bringing the improv practices of yes and into the working world, right? And I think this yes if is a great one to kind of add on top of that of, yes, we can do that if these conditions are right, or if these processes are in place, which is kind of a more systemic view. Cynthia, I know you're big into improving and optimizing processes to make sure that you're setting teams up for success. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to burnout?
I think a big part of a factor of burnout is not being heard. And when there's not a line of communication as to lay out, to enable empathy and the mutual understanding, then there's not a lot of process that can cover the root causes. So ultimately, it's people work together. They're human beings that are working together, and showing interest in the person and their goals, their intrinsic motivations, in addition to showing external motivations such as giving recognition, credit, etc. It does help to alleviate, or as an example of, it helps to alleviate the burnout. That's one suggestion. But in terms of process, some tactical suggestions is often having a good retrospective in the workflow, so that when teams run against challenges, they're able to talk about it, and there's an open, judgment-free forum, and then they can resolve it by assigning some sort of actionable to-do afterwards with a clear owner for completing that activity, and then coming back again with the team to discuss the results.
Tim, one quick add here, because I'm agreeing with everybody, what everybody said here, which is really around how we work together. But I'd remiss if we forgot, I think one area that I think is more of a process point here, which is, it's also important for engineering to share and surface what are the fixed costs the team is doing. So often burnout happens because, the engineering team is doing work that the business and product just don't recognize, right? And sometimes don't value, right? So if you're not bringing up what are the fixed costs, then I think that's sometimes where the pressure comes in from product, because they don't see market moving things actually happening, right? And so I think it's part of engineering's responsibility to surface where their time is really going, because it'll force a critical conversation. Sometimes the answer is that, that we should be recognized for it and keep trucking, but sometimes it should be forcing the hard conversation, which is, should we get out of this old product line, old maintenance feature that no one actually really thought they were paying for the whole time? And I think you can't put that on product alone to actually understand that that's happening.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew. Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into our next question too, right? Which is not just, where does the responsibility lie with product, but where does it lie with engineering as well? So the next question we have is, what do you feel are ways that engineering can be more compassionate towards product? I think you just highlighted a great one there, Andrew. Does anybody want to jump in on that question? Elle, I know you're big into cultivating sympathy between the engineering group and the product group. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the answer is kind of similar in the sense that I think building a strong relationship between both functions is really important, and a relationship that is founded on communication and trust and working towards the same things. And so I think there's also an element of building a culture of empathy more broadly at your company, where people are empathetic to and understanding of the fact that all of their colleagues are doing different work that they need to be aware of. And another thing that I would say is we at BookBub at least really value engineers who are product minded. And so we bring engineers into all different phases of the product lifecycle, from the very beginning ideation all the way through to refining ideas, in part because a lot of our engineers are super familiar with the products. They've been with them for a long time. They see them day to day. They know how they work. They might have creative ideas about how to approach a problem or get to an end solution from a slightly different perspective in a way that's easier to build or lower cost to build. And I think the more that you can bring those teams together to be doing some of those more ideation things at the same time, that can also help with building compassion for all of the work that the PMs are doing behind the scenes, and can also help engineers understand a little bit better what kind of trade-offs they need to be making and what trade-offs product is making, which is also, I think, ultimately a big part of your role as an engineer, is to provide product with the best possible information to make the best possible choices about how to achieve the goals that the whole company has. Because as an engineer, you're going to have a perspective and a knowledge base that your PMs likely won't, around either your specific product or around the potential range of solutions that are out there. And so in many ways, engineers are in service to product in that way, that not only in producing the end result, but in providing the information the product needs.
Yeah, Elle, something that you highlight, or that you mentioned there that I want to highlight, is around culture, right? And cultivating that culture within your organization. I'm definitely a big believer that culture is in the hands of everybody within an organization, and it's one of the critical factors within a startup. So I would invite anybody on the panel to jump in on this, but how does anybody who's listening to this right now go about actually cultivating culture within their organization?
In the first model, the first way to build culture is to demonstrate the culture that you want in the organization. As I think leading by example helps a long way. If you're willing to take on the challenges, the risks, bring your best self to work, fail publicly, that helps other people see that they can take their own risks as well. It depends on the values that you want to model, but that's one way to do it.
Cynthia, I completely agree. I would also add to talk about it, to say this is, communicate, this is the culture that we want, and then make communication just overly, just over communicate. Don't be afraid to over communicate when you're talking about these issues. I think a lot of people might question, should I say something? Is this something I should bring up? Make it a really safe place for people to bring up issues when they come up, and then act on them. I think, really walk the walk when it comes to what you're saying you want your culture to be like. When it isn't that way, if there's evidence to the fact that it isn't that way, then, what can you do to actively take action? And I think, now where more people are working at home, you don't have the same, in-person dynamics maybe. So that communication becomes even more important.
So Maribel, you mentioned over communicating. Mechanically, how does one go about that? Is it just about having conversations in the hallway when we don't have hallways anymore? Is it about just frequent emails, a lot of Slack conversations? Mechanically, how does one go about making sure they're over communicating?
Yeah, kind of similar to the tools conversation. I think it depends on your team and what works really well. I know on teams that I've been on, we use Slack a lot, and Slack is like okay, it doesn't really matter how little it is, I'm going to put it in Slack. And then, hey, you want to jump on a quick hangout or a Zoom call was like the standard of like, if it's more than 3 sentences, like let's just get on a call. And video call actually helps tremendously, because you get, and I'm very expressive with my face and with my hands, so you do get a little bit more context. So I think, using the tools that you have, whether it's Slack and email, or if it's a shared document or a Confluence document, or whatever the tools your team is using to communicate. And I think that's actually a part of it is, does everybody understand what we're using the communication tools for, so that they know, okay, this is okay to do on Slack, or this is okay to do on the shared doc, or what's the best way for me to communicate this? Yeah,
I love that, getting the working agreements in place for your team. Andrew, is that something you guys do at Jellyfish? Do you typically get into writing down your working agreements, or is that something you guys kind of just more into?
I think it's very apropos, because we're growing through that literally ourselves right now. Because I think when we were, 10, 15 people physically in the same room, I think it was less needing that, right? We're just jumping over 30 people now, and people are geographically disparate now, and I think it really kind of is pointing to us around how much we really need to actually go ahead and document things. I think that's probably one of the side effects of actually everybody working from home here, is how you actually have to advance that type of communication earlier in a company's evolution, because you don't get the flyby hallway conversations, the lunch chat, the elevator, the overhearing someone talking about something stuff, and you have to be much more deliberate. I also say, building on, I think, some of the stuff that everybody else has said here, but I think that context is super important. And you have to remember that when you're talking to someone, they may not know the context that they don't know about yet, right? So I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind that don't just talk in decisions and conclusions, that it's really important to actually share the context around and data around how you got from here to there. And I think especially as organizations are evolving, it's not a given that everybody actually is working off the same base, right? And so I think as leaders, I think it's really important for us to actually identify and share what kind of information we're working on, so that other people can come to similar conclusions or come to different conclusions, but at least you're working on the same starting point. And so, I think it's important to remember that, the other side of the conversation just won't know beforehand what they should be asking for. And it's our job to actually go share more, right? To kind of kickstart the conversation.
Andrew brought up a good point around we can't really rely on the hallway conversations, and so we need to be more vigilant about documentation. Sometimes I think we get into a habit of trying to recreate a context that is not, it doesn't do the current situation justice, because there is merits to having a virtual environment. The first is that there are people who probably wouldn't have been participating in the hallway conversations. They wouldn't have been in the in-group, and now they might have access to information, and they can think about it in their own time, through their own initiative. And that opens the conversation up more broadly too.
That's a really good point. And the other thing that I would add there is, I think being really explicit about some of these conversations is valuable, and can feel uncomfortable if it's not what you're used to doing. But the more that you can explicitly say, I think we should talk about team norms around, how our team talks about things, where our team takes notes, or what's the conversation like around this? What's our team culture around asking questions? What do we want it to be? The more that you explicitly set time aside for those questions, rather than just waiting for somebody to push for them to come up organically, the better off you'll be. And the other advantage there is that different people need different amounts of time and preparation to come up with ideas. And this is true across the board, whether you're talking about culture or product ideation or engineering. And so to your point, Cynthia, for people who might only feel comfortable speaking up if they've had an opportunity to really think through whatever the question is, if you set up time in advance and give people the time to think about it, you'll often get really great answers from people who aren't great at spontaneously speaking up, or being able to sort of extemporaneously talk about some new idea they've come up with. And so it's one of many ways to kind of adjust the diversity of opinion that comes out in your meetings.
Awesome. Speaking of setting expectations up in advance, Elle, one of the questions I have is what are some steps that product can take to be disciplined in saying no to features that have already been sold but might adversely impact engineering? I think it's a prime example of something that, if you kind of went through the whole sales process, you already gotten to that point, trying to say no at that point can be a little tough. So maybe setting those expectations up early is something that is a critical component to making sure that you're, keeping that healthy relationship between engineering and product. Can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on, setting those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally the way that you resolve this is that product and engineering are working so closely together that you never get to the point where product has pitched and sold something completely without getting engineering buy-in on some level. And I think that's the dream state, but obviously not always completely feasible. And so I think that's where the returning to that conversation is important, of saying, it would adversely impact engineering in this scenario that you've put together, but what does that actually mean? So lay it out for the PM so they have the information to decide. We can do this. If you want us to implement this feature, then we can either do it, we can do it quick, we can do it to spec, or we can do it right, and you get to pick two of the three. And give people the information about, like, if you want us to do this, it means we're going to trade off on X project, right? Because we can't get them both done. Or you need to staff us up, but it'll still take us longer. Or you need to do, or we could do a smaller version of this. If the goal is to get X product in the hands of people, could we instead build Y product that gets them most of the same thing? And would that be an acceptable MVP, even if it's not something we would build off of in the future? So just giving those options of like, here's a range of things, we're all gonna have to make this trade-off together, and let's figure out which of those is the best option. And I think in my experience, it's very rare that there's actually only one path forward. It's almost always the case that there are 4 or 5 different options you could pursue if you're thinking creatively about it, especially on the engineering side. And that's where getting more of the engineers involved who are familiar with the product and can tell you, oh, we did this thing before and it was a lighter weight way to do it, is going to help you a lot in trying to come up with creative solutions there.
Do you mind if I build on that? Right, because this is a good forum, by the way, because I think we're all nodding in these things. I don't think any of us are like deeply in conflict with this, but I think we can expand on this. I think you talked a lot about, I think, what are the tools the engineering team can do. You actually, Tim, started us talking about product, and so let's talk for a second on how product can actually work with the rest of the business. Let's simplify and say talk to sales. I think it's actually really important that product and engineering communicate regularly to the rest of the business what the roadmap actually is. And I think to build on what Elle was actually explaining, really share and remind everyone that it's a zero-sum game, right? Now, if you're going to go do this, we're not going to go do that. And it goes back to my earlier comment, which is I think people often forget to make sure that we are communicating and summarizing what everybody's doing at a given time. I think people often forget that. So if someone were to say like, hey, we have to have this thing, then something else it has to give, right? And that should be really ingrained and understood by the company as a whole. And the way that we can do that as leaders here is to actually be constantly sharing what's actually happening right now, what's coming down the pipe. If anybody wants to change it, they're welcome to suggest it, but that means something else has to give along the way. In many of the ways, possibly the way that Elle described, or just potentially not doing an entire set of things, right? I think often, the business world forgets that trade-off, and I think it's people that are closer to product engineering. Really, it's our job to make sure that's understood. That it's not magic. It doesn't matter how loud you yell, how many deals you sell. There's only so much time and hours in the teams, right, to get something done.
I really liked, Elle, your earlier answer when we were talking about something else of the yes if, because I think that that's very applicable too when we're talking about, yes, that feature that maybe has been sold can be done if we don't do these 5 things that we had planned to do. And it's all comes down to what is the priority for us as a business, as a company, not as a priority for engineering or for product management individually, but what is the priority for us as a company, as a business? What's the thing that really needs to happen for our customers? And so I know we're focusing a lot on the engineering teams, but back to we're all part of the same team. What's the thing that's going to keep us all employed? That's the other end, because if we don't deliver on enough good things and enough value in the product, then it doesn't matter. So I think that getting down to what's the priority and what are the trade-offs that we are willing to make, is this really the most important thing, and making that call. I would say though, sometimes I know I've been in that position where I think, maybe my senior leadership says, no, we really need to do this. And so that's the reason, because this, the CEO says we should. And so that's really hard. And one of the things that I have implemented in my team is to do like an impact value matrix for things that are new. Because then, we can kind of put them against each other. Like, okay, is it something that's really bringing a lot of value to a lot of customers? That would put it at the top. If it's something that's, low or really high value, but to like a very small percentage of our customers, that's not going to get ranked as high. So it kind of gave us all, including senior management, the same terminology to use and the same ranking of things of how important they truly, truly are.
Awesome. I appreciate bringing that conversation back to prioritization, because I thought that was, when I hear negotiation and trade-off and stuff, my mind definitely goes to prioritization. I know you've got some incredible thoughts on that, Maribel, so I'm glad you jumped in with that. That was awesome. So one thing I want to do for our audience is remind you guys that we do have that Slido link available, and we do have time set aside for audience questions. So I really encourage you guys to go ahead and put some questions in there so that we've got some good stuff to run through when we get to audience questions. For now, though, I do have another question for the panel. We've talked a lot about pulling engineering into the work of product and making sure that product is really involved with everything that engineers have going on in their day-to-day. So my next question is, can you guys give an example of a time when you successfully involved engineering in the product decision-making process? So how about Cynthia, let's start with you on your thoughts on that.
Earlier, the better. In some organizations, it's not feasible to invite everyone to the conversation at the same time, but as long as there's representatives from the engineering team that can relay the information to the other members of the team, it at least invites the engineering voice to the table. And that does a few things. One, it gives them a heads up of what's going to come down the road. Two, it allows them to provide feedback in case there are some glaring issues with whatever is being discussed or planned. And three, it builds morale. It shows that we're on equal footing. So with that context in mind, generally, when I start a new job, I really try to build that early relationship. And I hear out the engineering teams and see what are their pressing issues. If it's a situation where there's some technical debt in place, prioritizing that technical debt. So not everything, because we're in the process of money making, but at the same time, showing that sustainability and quality is important in an organization in the product roadmap goes a long way to building that line of communication and successfully launching projects.
Very cool. Does anybody else want to jump in with an example they have of pulling engineering into product? Yeah, Andrew?
It's less of an example, maybe just kind of a framework how we do things. I think it's, I think Elle actually alluded to this earlier around bringing engineering into kind of the into the broader product decision making. In enterprise software companies, I would actually go even further, which is take the engineers into the sales cycle, right? Bring them in actually participating in working on POCs, on early sales calls, because that actually brings empathy all the way to the customer's voice, right? And I guess in consumer company, if you're actually getting a chance to do user studies or interacting with actually end users, make sure that's fully visible, right? Whether it's a digital context or, I guess I think everything's digital now, but like whether it's in person, a Zoom meeting, or just transcripts of notes there, but get everybody involved as soon as possible. So then the decision isn't actually a discrete activity. The decision is actually happening over the sales process, over the product development lifecycle, over the ideation. So there's, in some ways, there's almost no decision because everyone kind of came to the similar conclusion as you actually evolved it. And so in that sense, it just becomes much more organic and dynamic. And I think you end up, in my theory, end up in a more optimal answer, right? Engineering understands what they're trying to build. We're not misspending on left and right. They kind of understand the goal that we're trying to get to.
In my experience, that when I've done this, when we've brought in engineers into the process, into the decision-making process, or into customer-facing events, to Cynthia's point, the morale is just so different. Their buy-in is so much more because they saw it firsthand, they've experienced it. It's not just me telling them, here's what our customer is asking for, or here's what would really help our customer. They saw it for themselves. They may have, heard it directly said to them. And so it's just it changed the conversation once we started doing that. And Elle, I think you mentioned that, you have very product-minded engineers. I think that was our goal, is to get to that point. And so doing that by having the engineering team at customer events, it's not always possible and not at every event, but where it's appropriate, I think it's a very fruitful endeavor.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. So I think that's all we got for moderator questions. So it looks like we've got a few more audience questions coming in. So we're going to go ahead and jump into some of those. And remember, folks, that anybody can ask a question in there. You can also upvote questions in there and have them race to the top, the popular ones. So the first one we have here is doing things fast and well, but documentation is a natural tension for this. What is your take on having a precise documentation? Who wants to jump in?
Well, the first thing about documentation that in my experience has been that documentation is a oftentimes our living, breathing documents. And coming in with the expectation that it has to be perfect, it has to be comprehensive, will generally set the team up for failure because we're also building and we're designing and we're planning and there's other activities. It's good to start incrementally, have the ideas on the paper or on Confluence or however your team wants to present the ideas. And then as features get updated, new information comes in, update it along the way periodically.
I think, sorry if you don't mind me jumping in on this one.
No, I want everyone to jump in. Go for it.
We already, I think, touched a little bit around this. I think everyone working from home has really kind of forced our collective hand on this. Like, I think more documentation is necessary earlier in a company's evolution, just simply because we're not able to actually have those kind of face-to-face conversations. We can have this kind of face-to-face, but not in person, and that loses some of the nuance there if we don't write it down. I think the other thing that's actually happening though too is that product's evolving quite a bit. I think people are used to a more agile and incremental way of doing things too. And so it no longer is this, when I started my career 20 years ago, you had to write everything down before anybody actually started anything. And I think now, and I think a lot of contemporary product, it's almost self-describing as it actually moves along. So I think in that sense, I think it lessens the need too, because you actually get to see it as it actually evolves in the business. In that way. So I think that's progress in both dimensions that we get to see.
And things have gotten smaller, like chunked up smaller in like smaller stories. And so I think that helps too. And for me, just tactically I'm typing while I'm talking usually. If I'm in a meeting, when I'm in the product manager role, as we're talking and I'm typing and the meeting minutes are live, or if I'm typing in Confluence or in Notion or whatever the tool is that we're using, it's live as we're talking, as we're doing. So there's not I have to go back and fill this in later. We did it while we were meeting, while we were making the decision.
The only thing I would add is I think that's totally right, Andrew, as we get closer and closer to having small deliverable chunks and moving more quickly and incrementally. The one slight flip side is I have seen that go too far in the other direction if we're just trying to run, and we're kind of putting the wheels on the car while it's going. And so there is an element of some amount of documentation and pre-thought can actually make you move much quicker, just because it prevents the conversation that otherwise has to happen in the middle of building a product or misunderstandings. And so there's always going to be this balance of fast doesn't always mean not taking the upfront steps to do documentation. Sometimes it just means the balance of how much do you need to document versus how much can you rely on the person having the right context because they've been in all the meetings, or who's taking it on and how much do they already have that you don't need to document.
And I think we should probably also separate documentation from process. I think we've already started that conversation. I think in the phraseology we've been talking about here is really documenting, like describing the feature. But I think if you look at the overarching discussion around process, I think the engineer is not the only consumer of this, right? And may not even be the end user the only consumer of the process, of any of the output. So when you look at it from a process lens, I think back to our very early conversation, we do have to think about who are the other stakeholders in the company and how are they consuming this, right? And so there may be a threshold for us to document or add process to the point where other stake members get what they're looking for to understand, is this going to satisfy my customer needs? If I'm a salesperson, is this going to get a deal sold? Does this actually describe where our time is going as a team, right, appropriately? And so there may be bars that actually need to be held higher than actually documentation for the engineer, or at least differently, right? When you look at it from the organization and process view.
Awesome. So we're getting a little short on time. I think we can maybe squeeze 2 more audience questions in. So we're going to shoot for it. So the next one we've got here is, how helpful is it to have a leader who's worked in both engineering and marketing, someone who knows the pains, the language, tasks of each side of that?
I would say, anytime you have somebody who is coming from multiple disciplines, that's great. But I think that there are a lot of ways to get exposed to the pains, languages, and tasks of a different discipline, and especially a different sort of focus area. So marketing is something where there are always also going to be PMs and engineers who are focused on marketing related work, not just people in the marketing organization. And so there's a lot of value to be had anytime you have someone who's coming in with multiple sides of experience who can kind of speak across the aisle, so to speak. But I also think that the more that you have open lines of communication and lots of sort of continued collaboration, the easier it is to have people who don't at all come from the same background still learn some of the same pains, languages, tasks, etc.
I'll say, who is this magic unicorn that is coming from product and marketing and insinuating maybe engineering too? Like, I think I would love that. I would love if we all had backgrounds from all these different areas, but that seems like a special person to find or be.
We definitely agree with that. So first off, before we move into our next question, I do want to say a lot of our audience questions that are coming in now are very good, and I feel bad that we're not going to have time to get to all of them. The next question we do have on the list, though, is as a PM, how do you toe the line between helpful / collaborative with the engineering team versus completing project management work for engineering? I think they meant product management work.
So this is something I wrestled with often in my career, because working with smaller to medium-sized companies, there may not be a scrum master or that kind of well-structured, like there might not be that asset in the organization. One thing I try to keep in mind is, where's my value add at the time? And I want to be as helpful to the team and to the business as possible. So depending on where the company is or where the product is, where the team is, the maturity of the team, I might find myself doing more of some role, some project management, then product management, some support rather than design. It really just kind of depends on where the situation is, for me personally. But one thing I think it is a big asset with the product organization, having somebody who does product, is the selling point is that if you have a good product person, you'll have a successful product that will generate the dividends for the company. And that's not something to lose at any point in the process. So if companies are asking the PM to be more of a project manager, more of a firefighter, I think they need to recognize that they're losing that resource and helping them develop things more strategically and make gains with new customers, for example.
I think sometimes I think we all should be able to wear multiple hats, right? I think everyone actually said that, the empathy and the communication across there. That all said, I think if product is actually spending so much time trying to actually help the engineering organization, it could argue that the engineering organization is under-resourced. They need more help there, whether it's formal engineering management, scrum mastering, or just kind of general team help. The fact is, if a product manager is spending all their time looking inwards of the team and not looking field facing, they're probably not able to do their real job too. And so that probably is a harbinger of something else.